Have you ever noticed how old people used to seem older? I don't just mean in years. I mean in the way they walked, the way they dressed, the way they just sat still on the porch, watching the day go by, like they weren't in a hurry to be anywhere but here. Back then, in the 1960s or 70s, old folks carried a kind of quiet gravity. They weren't flashy. They didn't dye their hair or wear sneakers. They wore thick cardigans even in summer, used a cane without shame, and smiled without showing teeth. They didn't talk much, but when they did, you listened. Because their words came slow, measured, like they'd thought about them first. And maybe you remember one too. A grandmother with silver hair always pinned up neatly. A grandfather who fixed clocks or read the same newspaper 3 times before throwing it away. Maybe you remember the soft clink of their teacup, or the sound of their rocking chair creaking gently against old floorboards. Maybe it's been a while since you've thought about them. And maybe tonight's a good time to do just that. Welcome back to Sleepytown Radio, where the past is soft, the stories are slow, and the nights never rush you. This evening, we're not going far. Just back a few decades, to a quieter neighborhood, a slower rhythm, and the old folks who helped shape it. Just by being there, they weren't perfect. Some were kind, some were grouchy. Some made jam from scratch, and others scolded you from behind lace curtains when you stepped on their lawn. But all of them had lived through things we'll never fully understand. The Depression, a world war, a world without phones, without air conditioning, without so many of the things we take for granted now. And yet they didn't complain. They just kept going. They seemed to age with more dignity, more simplicity, and maybe, just maybe, with more peace. Tonight, I'd like to invite you to settle in and remember what old folks used to be like. Not as an essay or a list of differences, but as a slow-moving picture, a living memory. We'll start with how they looked, and how, without saying a word, they let the world know exactly how far they'd come. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's drift back together. You could always tell who the old folks were, not just by the years they'd lived, but by the way they carried them. They moved a little slower, not because they were weak, but because they didn't see the need to rush. Their presence had weight, a stillness, like they had seen enough of the world to know when to speak and when silence was stronger. Old people in the 1960s and 70s didn't try to look young. That idea that you should fight aging, it wasn't really a thing. They didn't chase youth. They wore age like an old, trusted coat, heavy, a little worn, but honest. Grandmothers wore dresses that buttoned all the way up, with sleeves to the elbow and collars that hugged the neck. No stretchy waistbands or modern patterns, just stiff fabric and simple floral prints. Many wore aprons even when they weren't cooking, because that's what they were used to doing. Their shoes were black, often lace-up, with thick heels, made for practicality, not comfort. They weren't soft. Neither were the women who wore them. Stockings held up by garters, slips under their dresses, and never pants. Even on the hottest days of summer, they dressed like they were going to church. No shorts, no sandals, no exceptions. And if they complained about the heat, you didn't hear it. Hair was always neat, white, or that soft powder blue that came from rinse dye. Rarely cut short, but always pinned or pulled back with care. No highlights, no balayage, no younger-looking anything. It was considered vain to dye your hair just to hide the gray. Why would you? You'd earned that gray. The men wore slacks, real ones, pressed and belted. Even if they were just walking to the mailbox, you'd see them in long-sleeved shirts, buttoned right up to the second-to-last button, with suspenders holding up trousers that had seen better days but were always clean. Some still wore fedoras or flat caps, not to be stylish, but because they always had. And if they smoked a pipe, well, then you remember that smell even now. Sweet, musty tobacco lingering in the folds of their coat. They looked old by today's standards. Not worn out, but seasoned. Their hands had spots, and their backs curved forward a bit. But there was pride in their step, however slow. They didn't wear sneakers or jogging suits. They weren't out power walking. They weren't active seniors. They were just old, and they didn't pretend otherwise. You could always recognize them from afar. Even their posture told a story. Many of the women stood with hands clasped in front, fingers gently folding over one another like they were holding prayers. The men often leaned, on canes, on fences, on the edge of a porch, not out of weakness, but as if they'd earned the right to lean after all those years of standing tall. There's a photo I keep in an old drawer, one of those faded Polaroids from 1971. In it, my great-grandmother is sitting on a wooden bench beside a rose bush. She's wearing a thick sweater in July, her ankles crossed, her hands resting in her lap. She's not smiling for the camera. She's just there, present, still, and that's what I remember most. Old folks didn't demand attention. They didn't pose. They didn't broadcast their lives. They simply lived them, with a quiet dignity that filled the room the moment they stepped inside. In those days, age wasn't something to be erased. It was something to be respected. It meant survival, experience. It meant you had seen floods and fires and winters that came early. It meant you'd lost people and kept going anyway. And maybe that's what made them so different. Not their clothes, or their hair, or even the way they looked at us from under those wire-rimmed glasses, but the weight of the years they carried, and how lightly they tried to place that weight on others. So much of who they were showed up in how they moved. Slow, careful, with purpose. They didn't fidget or pace. They sat with hands folded and let time unfold around them. It's a rhythm that doesn't exist much anymore. A kind of patience. The kind you only get when you've been through enough to know that most things can wait. And as the years pass, as we find ourselves growing older, I wonder if we'll carry ourselves the same way, with that quiet strength, that effortless grace, and that calm acceptance of time. They may have looked older than we do now, but maybe that's because they were older, in spirit, in silence, in stillness. They didn't need to announce their age. You could feel it in every slow step, in every soft nod, and in the way they looked at you, not to be seen, but to truly see you. Let's stay here a while and remember what it felt like to see them move through the world with that strange, comforting mix of strength and softness, because next, we're going to step into a typical day in their lives. And trust me, it's slower, simpler, and sweeter than you might remember. You didn't need a calendar to know what day it was. When you grew up around old folks in the 60s or 70s, you just listened. If you heard the back screen door squeak open around 6:30 a.m., that meant it was Monday. Laundry day. Linens and handkerchiefs would already be soaking in the sink, with that sharp, bluing smell hanging in the air. If the smell of bacon fat and cornmeal hit you before 7 a.m., it was probably a Sunday, church day, clothes laid out the night before, Bibles stacked by the door. The days followed a rhythm so slow and steady, it almost felt sacred. Morning started early, but never rushed. Grandma would hum hymns while cracking eggs into a bowl, never looking at a recipe. She didn't need one. Her hands remembered what her mind no longer had to think through. A pinch of salt, a splash of buttermilk. Flour sifted just once, not twice. Biscuits didn't come from cans. They came from practice and patience. By the time the sun cut across the kitchen linoleum, Grandpa had already stepped outside to check the garden. You could hear the soft clap of the screen door as he went. Then the creak of the wooden porch. Then silence. He didn't say where he was going. He never did, but you knew. He'd be out there with his hat low over his brow, quietly pulling weeds from between rows of tomatoes, picking off beetles, turning the soil with his pocket knife, and every now and then pausing just to look up at the sky, not because he was waiting for anything, but because he had the time. Back inside, the radio played low. AM band, of course. The kind of station where someone read the farm report and the forecast with equal reverence, and in the background, the slow scrape of a metal spoon in a ceramic bowl, the sigh of a chair being pushed back, the clink of silverware on thick porcelain plates. Even sound moved slower then. After breakfast, Grandma would wipe down the counters, even if they were already clean. Then she'd fold the same towels she folded yesterday. Then check the pantry. Then check the freezer. Not because she forgot, but because that's just how you managed a household. She made lists in pencil. She saved twist ties and rubber bands in an old cookie tin. She wore an apron with faded red cherries on it. It had a pocket. That's where she kept a tissue, just in case someone started to cry. Around mid-morning, she'd open the windows, just a crack, and let the air move through the house. If it was hot, she'd make sun tea in a glass jar on the porch. If it was cool, she'd light a burner just to warm the kitchen a little. But never the whole house. That would be wasteful. Grandpa would come back in, bringing the scent of fresh-cut grass or warm earth with him. He'd rinse his hands in the sink, wipe them on a towel, and sit in the same chair he always sat in, the one with the arms worn smooth by time. He'd read the paper, the whole paper, not scrolling, not skimming, front to back, comics included. Then he'd fold it, set it aside, and just sit. That was a thing old folks knew how to do. Sit. Just sit. Lunch was never fancy, but always enough. A tomato sandwich in the summer, ham and bean soup in the winter, maybe a slice of leftover pie from the night before. Always served on real plates, even if it was just the two of them. Paper plates were for picnics. After lunch, there was often a nap. Not because they were lazy, just because they'd earned it. They might rest in the living room with the curtains half drawn, Grandpa with one hand resting on his chest, Grandma with a crocheted blanket over her lap. Even in July, the house would fall quiet, save for the soft ticking of the wall clock or the occasional rattle of a truck going by, and no one called during nap time. That would have been rude. By mid-afternoon, the house would slowly stir again. Grandma might bake something, cookies or cornbread, depending on the weather. Grandpa might sweep the front steps or refill the bird feeder. And if the grandkids were around, that's when things got lively. A pitcher of Kool-Aid on the counter. Ice cubes cracked from plastic trays. A deck of cards set out on the dining table. Stories about the old days that drifted between fact and folklore. Old folks didn't play with you the way parents did, but they watched. They laughed softly. They let you be wild in a quiet kind of way. Sometimes they'd call you over just to hand you a peppermint or ask you to fetch something from the garage. Not because they needed it, but because they wanted to see you move, wanted to feel needed. Just a little. As the sun began to slope low, supper came without fanfare. No one asked, "What do you want for dinner?" You ate what was made. A roast, a casserole, fried chicken if you were lucky. Everything had a place. Dishes were passed clockwise. Blessings were said slowly. And everyone helped clear the table when it was done. The evening didn't bring screens or scrolling. It brought front porches, swings creaking, radios murmuring baseball scores, the sound of cicadas tuning up for the night. If you were lucky, you'd get a story. One of those long ones that didn't go anywhere fast. One that drifted and circled and settled in like a soft fog. And you'd listen, not because you had to, but because somehow you knew you wouldn't always get to. That was a day in their life. Ordinary, beautiful, slow. A rhythm that most of the world has forgotten. But maybe tonight we can remember it. Together. Because next we'll talk about what they taught us. Not with lectures or rules, but with their example. Their quiet routines. Their steady presence. Their lives lived on purpose. So let's stay with them a little longer. They rarely raised their voices. They didn't sit you down for long speeches or moral lessons. There were no whiteboards, no lectures. And yet somehow, the old folks from the 1960s and 70s taught us more than any textbook ever could. Because they didn't preach, they showed. They taught by folding laundry while humming softly. By sweeping the porch every morning without fail. By bowing their heads before every meal. Even if it was just a sandwich and a pickle, they showed us that routine was a kind of love. That showing up every day, even for small things, mattered. They taught us with the way they stood when someone walked in the room. With the way they said, "Yes, sir," or "Thank you, ma'am." Not because they were forced to, but because that's how you treated people. They taught us patience by never rushing us out the door. Taught us generosity by always giving us the better slice of pie. Taught us respect by letting us speak, even when we were wrong, and quietly correcting us later. Old folks didn't worry much about being understood. They just lived in a way that made understanding inevitable. They taught us to finish what we started, not with threats, but by finishing what they started. The sweater half knitted, the garden half planted, the floor half mopped. They didn't leave things undone. That was their way, and slowly that became our way too. They didn't say things like, "Be kind." They just were kind. They looked out for neighbors without being asked. They dropped off extra tomatoes from the garden, slipped dollars into birthday cards, and shoveled snow from a widow's walkway without ever mentioning it. They taught us community without calling it that. Taught us humility without needing applause. They didn't scold us for being selfish. They just kept giving, and when they needed something, which wasn't often, they asked gently, or not at all. There were phrases they repeated, and somehow those stuck. Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Don't borrow trouble. God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. They weren't trying to be clever. They were just passing down what had been passed to them. We didn't always understand it then, but those words echo louder now. Sometimes they taught us by doing nothing at all. When we made mistakes, they didn't explode. They just gave us that look. You know the one. A glance that said, "You'll carry this longer than you think." It was never about shame. It was about reflection. They wanted us to feel it. Sit with it. Learn from it. Because consequences weren't always punishment. Sometimes they were just quiet time. I remember once knocking over my grandfather's pipe stand, a handmade thing he'd carved himself. The pipes rolled everywhere, and I panicked. He didn't yell, didn't even sigh. He just knelt down beside me, picked one up, turned it over in his hand, and said, "Accidents happen. Just don't make a habit of it." That was all. But I still think about it, because he taught me something that day. You can correct someone without crushing them. They taught responsibility by trusting us. At 10 years old, you could be handed a list and $5 and sent to the store. You knew which bread to buy, which change to count. You knew to say thank you to the cashier and to walk back without dawdling. They didn't hover. They expected, and that expectation made us rise. They taught us how to be still, how to sit through a church sermon without fidgeting, how to wait our turn without whining, how to listen without interrupting. Even boredom had value. It meant you were learning how to be with yourself. They taught us that not everything needed to be fixed, that sometimes you could just sit beside someone who is sad, not offer advice, not fill the silence, just be there. They taught us that love wasn't loud. It was steady. It was putting on the kettle when someone came to visit. It was folding the socks just right. It was remembering how you liked your toast. Most of what they taught us wasn't about rules. It was about rhythm, the way the same things happened day after day, and how, in that repetition, we found peace. They didn't chase novelty. They honored tradition, and while the world around them changed fast, they held tight to what they knew. Manners matter, work is good, rest is earned, and kindness leaves a longer mark than anger ever could. It wasn't until we were older that we realized how much we'd learned from them, from the way Grandma wiped the counter twice, from the way Grandpa nodded when we passed him the salt. It all meant something, and still does. So next, we'll talk about how they watched over the world around them, our neighborhoods, our mischief, our safety. Because old folks weren't just quiet teachers, they were also quiet guardians. There was always at least one old person on the block who knew everything. They weren't nosy. They weren't gossips. They were just observant. They noticed who came and went, which kids were walking to school, and which ones were sneaking off to the candy store. They knew if your lawn was too long, if your dog got out again, if your screen door was squeaking more than usual. They didn't write things down. They didn't take pictures. They just saw and remembered. And somehow it made the whole neighborhood feel safer. Old folks had a way of making you straighten up without saying a word. You'd be halfway down the street with your slingshot and a bad idea, and then you'd spot Mrs. Kessler sitting on her porch, not staring, just present, her eyes following you beneath the brim of a wide straw hat. And somehow, that was enough to make you think twice. They didn't need to yell. Their presence was the warning. There was a time when neighborhoods felt more like extended families, and the old folks were the elders, the quiet judges of right and wrong, the protectors of routine. If something seemed off, they were the first to notice. A light left on too long, a kid walking home alone, a car that didn't belong. They didn't panic. They didn't call 911 right away. They just watched, waited, asked questions. Sometimes that's all it took. They had their own way of passing along justice. One look from Mr. Peterson across the fence was enough to make you confess before you'd even been accused. He didn't yell when you stepped on his flowers. He just told your father later that evening. And somehow, that was worse. Back then, it wasn't just your parents you had to answer to. It was the whole block, every old woman behind a curtain, every grandfather raking leaves. They were watching, and they held you accountable. But it wasn't just about discipline. They were also the first to notice when you were limping, or when you looked a little pale. They remembered birthdays. They saved your favorite cookie in a tin, just in case you dropped by. And during snowstorms, it was automatic. You and your brothers would go shovel their walk, not for money, not because anyone told you to, because that's what you did. They'd open the door while you worked, smile, and say, "Don't forget the back steps." And afterward, they'd send you home with something warm, a cinnamon roll, or a slice of pie. That was the exchange. You watched out for them. They watched out for you. I remember once getting into trouble for throwing snowballs at passing cars. I was 8. It seemed like harmless fun until a snowball hit the windshield of Mr. Thompson's Buick. He didn't even get out of the car, didn't yell. But by the time I got home, my mom was standing at the door, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Go to your room," she said. "Your father will deal with you when he gets home." I knew exactly what had happened. Mrs. Wiggins, 2 houses down, always sitting near the window with her knitting. She had seen everything, and she had called. But here's the thing. A week later, she handed me a plate of oatmeal cookies, still warm. No lecture, no mention of the snowball, just cookies, because that's how it worked. Correction without cruelty. Discipline wrapped in love. Every neighborhood had its grouch, too. That one old man who didn't like kids, didn't like dogs, didn't like noise. You know the one. Yard always perfect. Fence always freshly painted. Ball goes over. It doesn't come back. If you cut across his grass, he'd threaten to call the cops. And maybe he did. But even he had a story. Even he had a reason. Maybe he'd lost someone. Maybe his body hurt more than he let on. And deep down, we kind of respected him too, because even his grumpiness was part of the rhythm of the block. You knew where the line was, and he helped define it. There were no apps, no surveillance cameras, but we had better security than we do now. We had old folks on porches, on balconies, behind curtains, and their eyes were kind. Usually, they waved, they nodded, they let you know they saw you, which meant you mattered. And if something went really wrong, like someone fell off their bike, or the power went out, or a dog got loose, old folks were the first ones on the scene. They kept flashlights in known places. They had spare candles. They knew which neighbors had babies and which ones lived alone. They didn't need training. They had instincts. And those instincts came from decades of paying attention. Even now, when I visit an old neighborhood, I still look for them. Someone rocking slowly. Someone watering their flowers with a tin can. Someone who sees you before you see them. And when you wave, they wave back, as if to say, you turned out okay, because that was their job in a way, not just to catch you doing wrong, but to help you grow up right. Next, we'll take a deeper look at the quiet strength they carried, through pain, through aging, through hard years, because what they saw from the porch was only part of what they carried in their hearts. They didn't talk much about pain. It wasn't that they didn't feel it. They just carried it differently. Old folks back then lived with aches that never fully went away. Bad knees, stiff backs, shoulders that clicked when they stirred the soup. But they didn't complain. Not out loud, at least. They would wince quietly when they sat down, grasp the armrest a little tighter when rising, rub a joint when they thought no one was watching, and then they'd go back to it, back to baking, back to weeding, back to shelling peas or folding laundry like it was just another part of being alive. There were no yoga mats, no ergonomic chairs, no trips to the chiropractor or physical therapy 3 times a week, just liniment rubbed in at night, a hot water bottle pressed to the lower back, and a good night's rest, if the weather let you have it. They used canes without shame, walked slow and steady, sometimes with both hands behind their back. And they didn't try to hide the struggle, but they didn't make a show of it either. There was no ibuprofen in every drawer, no freezer full of pre-packaged meals. They cooked standing up, sometimes leaning on the counter. They bent down to scrub floors, hung laundry on the line, even when their shoulders ached, because the job had to get done. And that was reason enough. Many of them lived with conditions that today would come with a dozen prescriptions and specialists. Arthritis, glaucoma, sciatica, high blood pressure, diabetes. But you wouldn't know it unless you saw the pill box. If they even had one. There were no ice packs for twisted ankles, just a dish rag soaked in cold water and a chair by the fan. And yet, they didn't see themselves as suffering. They saw it as aging. Getting old was expected to come with a certain amount of pain, and they bore it with the same quiet pride they carried through everything else, because they'd been through worse. A winter with no heat, a summer with no air, a birth at home with no nurse, no epidural. They'd buried siblings and spouses and sometimes children, lived through wars and ration books, went without meat, without sugar, without new shoes. Pain wasn't new, and it wasn't a surprise, so they didn't fear it. They just adapted. There were no hip replacements back then. Not the way there are now. You got a bad hip? You used a cane. You got a worse hip? You moved slower. Your joints ached in the cold? You added an extra blanket, drank tea, waited for spring. It sounds simple, maybe even romanticized, but it was hard. And that's the thing. Old folks didn't avoid hard. They didn't think life was supposed to be easy. They just figured you got up every day and did what needed doing, even if it hurt. And somehow, through all of that, they still smiled. They still called you dear when you came to visit. Still baked birthday cakes. Still sent cards written in shaking cursive. They took pride in little things. A pie crust that didn't crack. A row of carrots that grew straight. The clean scent of sheets dried on the line. They didn't need much. They were satisfied with small successes, and maybe that was the source of their quiet strength. Not that they never hurt, but that they never let the hurt turn them bitter. Some of them had physical pain. Others carried the kind you can't see. Grief, loneliness, memories that visited in the middle of the night. They'd lost friends in wars, seen factories close down, watched their kids move away. They felt it deeply, but they didn't burden you with it. If they cried, they did it alone or in the dark. And when morning came, they put on the kettle. Like always, strength isn't always loud, and resilience doesn't always look like a pep talk or a motivational quote. Sometimes it's just a woman with swollen fingers pulling weeds from her rose bed. Sometimes it's a man with a bad back standing in church for the full hymn. Sometimes it's someone who doesn't ask for help, but doesn't resent you for not offering. They were tough, not because they wanted to be, but because they had to be. And in that toughness, there was tenderness too. They knew how to hold space for sorrow without letting it swallow the whole day. They knew how to keep going and how to keep loving, even when everything ached, even when the world felt a little too quiet. So when we think about how old folks were different back then, maybe this is the part we miss most. That silent strength, the kind that didn't need recognition, the kind that didn't need a name. They just lived it every single day. And next, we'll talk about those lives they lived. How grandmothers kept whole families running with nothing but a mixing bowl, a broom, and a prayer. How grandfathers rose before dawn and kept the garden going long after their hands began to tremble, because behind their strength was a kind of quiet devotion that held everything and everyone together. They weren't superheroes, but looking back now, it's hard to believe how much they carried. The grandmothers and grandfathers of the 1960s and 70s didn't wear capes or raise their voices. They didn't make speeches or write manifestos, but they held families together, and they did it quietly. Let's start with the grandmothers. She was usually the first one up. Before the coffee perked, before the sun fully broke the horizon, she was already tying her apron. She didn't do yoga. She didn't journal. She didn't go on self-care retreats. She just started the day with her hands, cooking, folding, sweeping, praying. She ironed shirts with heavy steam irons, scrubbed bathtubs on her knees, clipped coupons, and remembered everyone's birthdays. She managed the family budget with a pencil and a steno pad, saved every button, reused every jar. But more than what she did, it was how she was. She listened more than she talked. She served the biggest slice of pie to the person who needed it most. She could settle a child just by resting a hand on their back. She could hold grief without unraveling. Her laugh was rare but unforgettable. She was the kind of woman who said things like, "We'll get through it," or "God willing," or simply, "It's not the end of the world, honey." And when she said it, you believed her. She didn't expect much, just good manners, a clean plate, and for everyone to show up at the table when dinner was ready. If she was tired, she didn't say it. If she was sad, she let the pie crust tell you. And when things went wrong, when money was tight, when someone got sick, when someone broke the rules, she didn't panic. She just moved a little slower, stayed a little longer at the sink, and then she got back to work. Now let's talk about the grandfathers. He didn't say much, but when he did, you listened. He fixed things, quietly. A loose hinge, a leaky pipe, a birdhouse that had fallen from the tree. He worked with his hands, even after they started to tremble. He rose early. He drank his coffee hot, black, and fast. He mowed the lawn in straight lines, read the newspaper front to back, tipped his cap to neighbors walking by, and he almost always carried change in his pocket, just in case. He didn't need to be the center of attention. He was content to sit in the corner of the room and just be there, present, solid, like the post on the front porch that never needed replacing. He showed love in his own way. filling your gas tank without telling you, carving your name into a wooden toy, keeping the lawn chairs clean, fixing the swing, carrying the weight of memory quietly. Wars, losses, hard winters, never asking for recognition. He was the one who knew how to sharpen a knife, how to shell peas with one hand, how to whistle loud enough to call someone from the end of the street. He taught you how to skip a stone, how to respect your elders, how to shake a hand properly. He never called himself wise, but he was. Not because of what he said, but because of how he lived. Both of them, these grandmothers of iron and grandfathers of quiet resolve, believed in doing things the right way. Not the easy way, not the quick way, but the right way. Because there was dignity in effort, honor in showing up. Even if your back hurt, even if your heart was heavy. They didn't ask to be thanked, didn't expect praise. They took care of the people around them because that's what love looked like to them. A meal on the table, a mended sock, a light left on when you were late getting home. Their strength wasn't the kind you saw in movies. It was quieter than that. It was in the way she sat with you when you were sick, in the way he stood behind you at your school concert without ever saying a word. It was in the way they loved each other without needing to perform it for anyone. And when they were gone, it felt like something foundational had shifted, like a cornerstone missing from a house you didn't even know was being held up. But if you listened closely, they left something behind, not just recipes and tools and black and white photographs, but a way of being, a quiet faith in simple things. A belief that hard work mattered, that decency wasn't old-fashioned, that love didn't need to be loud to be lasting. We remember them not because they asked us to, but because they shaped us with every soft-spoken word, every pot of stew, every rusty hammer. And next, we'll walk back into their stories, the ones they told over and over again, the ones they never quite finished, because behind every old car in the driveway, behind every creaky floorboard and yellowed letter, was a life quietly and fully lived. There was something about old cars, not just the smell of worn leather and sun-baked dashboards, not just the way the doors closed with a deep, satisfying thunk, but the stories they carried. You could stand in any small-town driveway in the 1960s or 70s and see one. A Hudson Hornet with the paint worn thin on the hood. A Packard with white wall tires and a dented fender. A Studebaker sitting half in the shade, as if resting. They weren't collector's items. They were just the car, the one your grandfather bought new in 1952. After saving for 7 years. The one he washed by hand every other Sunday. The one he kept in the garage like it was part of the family. Most old folks didn't get a new car every few years. They bought one, a good one, and they made it last. It carried groceries, grandkids, and grief. It carried Sunday hats and picnic baskets and shoe boxes filled with receipts. It smelled like peppermint, pipe smoke, and old upholstery. If you were lucky, you got to sit in the front seat. If you were smaller, you slid around on the vinyl in the back, trying not to stick to it in summer. There were no seat belts. Not always. No cup holders. No screens. Just the road and the hum of the engine and the crackle of the AM radio. And old folks told stories the same way they kept those cars. Slowly, carefully, and only when it mattered. You might sit with your grandfather on a summer night, the porch light flickering behind you, and he'd start with, "You know, this reminds me of a time," and then you'd be gone to a different town, a different decade, to a dance hall lit by strings of yellow bulbs, to a battlefield where he learned more about fear than he ever told you, to a train station in 1946 where he saw your grandmother for the first time, standing beside a green suitcase with a daisy pinned to her collar. He wouldn't tell it all, just enough. They didn't share everything. Some stories stayed folded in the glove box of their hearts, but when they did tell you something, you held on to it, because their words weren't casual. They were deliberate, thought out, passed down like heirlooms. Old souls didn't waste breath. They didn't embellish. They just said what they had to say and let the silence carry the rest. And when you listened, really listened, you could feel the weight of their years, the way memory curled around every syllable, the way time softened the sharpest edges. Sometimes you'd find one of those old cars at the edge of town, sitting behind a sagging barn or under a tarp in a backyard. And even then, it felt like something sacred. Not junk, not forgotten, just waiting for someone to remember, to ask, whose was that? Where did it go? What did it carry? Because the car was never just a car, it was a witness. 2 drives made in silence after bad news. To family vacations with bologna sandwiches packed in wax paper. To first kisses. To final goodbyes. And the stories, they weren't always dramatic. Sometimes they were about pie contests and county fairs, about the year it snowed in April, about the neighbor who never returned your shovel. They were told with half a smile and a slow drawl, with pauses that weren't for effect. They were just real, and they didn't always have a point. They were just told because they mattered to someone, and that made them enough. Old folks didn't rush the telling. They let the story breathe. They'd lean back in their chair, sip from a mug of coffee or sweet tea, and speak like the words themselves were coming home. And when they stopped, it wasn't with a grand finale. It was with a nod, a shift in their seat, a quiet, "That was a long time ago," and somehow, that said more than anything else. They were old souls, yes, but not tired ones. They had lived through decades we read about in books, survived years that would bend most of us, and yet they sat there, steady, kind-eyed, full of stories, not because they wanted attention, but because they knew stories matter, and that one day, someone else would need them. Someone would remember the sound of that car door closing, the way Grandpa's voice dropped when he spoke about the war, the way Grandma always looked out the window when it rained, like she was waiting for something or someone. Next, we'll look at how aging itself looked different back then, how old folks seemed older, not because they gave up, but because they leaned into the season of life they were in, and they did it without apology, without fear, without fuss, because they knew something we're just now beginning to relearn. That growing older isn't something to fight. It's something to carry. Growing old in the 1960s and 70s looked and felt very different from how it does today. Back then, reaching 60 wasn't seen as a new chapter to reinvent oneself or take up yoga. It was, quite plainly, being old. And there wasn't anything wrong with that. At 60, most had white or gray hair and wore it proudly. No coloring kits from the drugstore, no hair plugs or trendy hairstyles to appear younger. Men combed their hair back neatly, often with a side part. Women kept it short and curled or pinned back with gentle care. Wrinkles were not fine lines to be smoothed over. They were earned. They told stories of summers spent in the garden, winters by the wood stove, and lifetimes spent raising families, working hard, and worrying quietly. The idea of anti-aging was nearly non-existent. No vitamin infusions or collagen powders, no creams promising youth. Most folks didn't count their steps. They counted blessings. They didn't wear fitness trackers. They wore wristwatches passed down from their fathers. Their posture might have curved a little, their pace slower, but it wasn't weakness, it was reverence. A bowed back came from decades of labor, lifting grandchildren, tending gardens, and doing laundry with wringer washers. Their hands were strong and veined, with knuckles worn from years of real work. If you looked closely, you could see life etched into their skin like a story written in calligraphy. At 70, many carried a cane, not for show, but because their knees had simply given out. After a lifetime of walking through storms and winters, across gravel roads and kitchen floors, they didn't see mobility as something owed to them. They saw it as something to be thankful for, day by day. Each walk to the mailbox, each trip to church, was a quiet victory, and if someone lived to 80, that was something to pause for. Something the neighborhood noticed. Folks might bring over a pie. Children might whisper with awe, "She's 80," as though it were something sacred. And maybe it was. Reaching such an age didn't mean zip-lining or second careers. It meant slowing down, truly slowing down. Sitting by a window for hours, watching birds, remembering things aloud even when no one was around to hear. Aging wasn't something to be denied. It was something to be allowed. There was no, "I'm 60, but I feel 30. There was simply, "I'm 60. It wasn't that they aged better or worse. It was that they aged honestly. There was dignity in that. Quiet dignity. They knew life came in seasons, and instead of clinging to summer, they leaned into autumn. They wore sweaters and drank warm tea. They listened to the radio, not podcasts. They took naps. They wrote letters. Perhaps it's not just that people aged differently, but that we looked at aging differently. We didn't ask, "How can I look younger?" We asked, "What can I pass on?" The focus wasn't on staying relevant. It was on staying kind, thoughtful, present. In a way, they weren't afraid of being forgotten. They were afraid of not leaving something meaningful behind. They aged with the seasons, letting go, making peace, becoming still. They didn't push back against time. They made room for it. And now, thinking back, we might remember the way they'd sit on a porch swing, or in the back pew of church, or by the window with a cup of tea, and think, this is what growing old used to look like. Not glamorous, not optimized, just real. Up next is a reflection on the kind of wisdom those quiet years left behind, the kind that still whispers in our hearts today. Some things aren't said out loud. They live in the quiet spaces, between sips of coffee, in the nod of an old man on his porch, or in the silence that follows a softly spoken, "Be careful out there." The old folks of the 1960s and 70s carried a wisdom that didn't demand attention. It didn't need applause or microphones. It just was. They didn't post inspirational quotes on the fridge. They lived them. "You reap what you sow" wasn't something they tweeted. It was something you understood when you saw your grandmother weeding her garden at sunrise, or your grandfather tightening the hinges on a neighbor's fence without being asked. Their lessons weren't loud, but they lingered. Back then, aging wasn't a race against time. It was an arrival, a homecoming. You got old, not because you lost something, but because you had gained something: experience, patience, acceptance. Elders didn't have to prove their relevance. Their presence was enough. When they sat at the table, the room settled. When they spoke, even if briefly, people listened, because they knew whatever was said had been steeped in years. These are people who had lived through dust bowls and blackouts, wars and recessions, joy and heartbreak. They didn't need to scream to be heard. Their silence often said more than words could. A quiet sigh, a knowing smile, a look that said, "You'll understand one day." They didn't interrupt. They didn't over-explain. And maybe that's why their words felt heavier when they came, like a pebble dropped into still water. You heard it, and then you kept hearing it in the ripples long after. Even their advice came gently. It wasn't, "You should do this." It was, "Well, here's what worked for me." And they listened. Really listened. They didn't look past you while you were talking. They weren't half-typing a reply on a screen while nodding. When they listened, they looked you in the eye, and you knew you were being heard. There's something sacred about that kind of presence. They taught us that you don't have to be flashy to be meaningful. You don't have to be loud to be strong. And you don't have to be young to be full of life. Because life isn't always about the noise. It's about the stillness in between. The slow walk to the mailbox. The hands folding laundry. The stories that aren't written down, but still live on in your bones. And today, in a world where every voice is trying to rise above the rest, maybe we're missing the ones that speak the softest, the ones that aren't trending, the ones who don't interrupt, but quietly wait until they're invited in. Maybe that's what we're really aching for. Not more content, but more connection. Not more sound, but more silence we can trust. The kind of silence that once filled small kitchens while biscuits rose in the oven, or drifted through front yards as neighbors waved from across the street. The elders of yesterday weren't perfect, but they were steady. And there's a difference. Steadiness doesn't mean knowing everything. It means showing up. It means not panicking when the world tilts. It means saying, "Let's sit down and talk," even when you don't know how to fix it. Their wisdom wasn't about solving every problem. It was about holding space for you while you tried. It was about believing in you, even if they never said the words out loud. Because some of them came from a generation that wasn't taught to say, "I love you," but they'd keep the porch light on just in case you came home late. That's love, and that's wisdom. So maybe the question isn't just, were old people different back then? Maybe it's, are we still making room for that kind of wisdom today? As we grow older in a noisier world, perhaps the best thing we can do is remember how to be quiet, not absent, but quiet, not detached, but still, like the elders we once knew, like the ones who could say more with a pause than most can with a paragraph, because somewhere in that hush is a lesson worth hearing. And so we come to the quiet end of the evening. Outside, the world has settled into stillness. The porch light hums. A breeze stirs the leaves, but the old rocking chair has long stopped moving. It's just you now, lying there, eyes half closed, heart a little softer than when we began. Maybe you can still picture them, the old folks of another time, their wrinkled hands resting gently in their laps, their quiet stares fixed on the sunset or on some memory no one else could quite see. They weren't trying to be wise, they weren't aiming to teach. And yet, somehow, they did. They taught us that silence has weight, that a pause in conversation can say more than 1,000 rushed words. They showed us how to endure, how to give without asking, how to simply be. Not perform, not prove, just be. You see, the old people we knew back then didn't need a platform or an audience. Their value wasn't measured in productivity or posts. It was found in the worn pages of their lives, in the creak of a screen door, in the smell of biscuits baked from memory. Some of them never traveled far. Some lived in the same home for 50 years. Some never learned to drive, but all of them traveled inward, deep into a kind of stillness most of us today run from. And maybe that's why we remember them so vividly, not for the things they had, but for the presence they carried, the calm, the patience, the knowing nod, the way they made us feel safe, even when the world outside felt anything but. So tonight, before you drift off, take one last moment to remember that kind of presence. Maybe it was your grandma humming in the kitchen. Maybe it was your neighbor sitting on the stoop with a glass of iced tea. Maybe it was a stranger you only met once, but never forgot. In a world filled with noise, their quiet still echoes. And now, as the last lights fade and the hush deepens, let this story and their memory rock you gently to sleep. Good night, kiddo. Sleep tight. We'll be here next time.